The map room in the Kremlin was thick with cigarette smoke on November 13th, 1942, when Marshal Georgy Zhukov spread out the operational plan for what would become known as Operation Uranus, tracing with his finger the proposed pincer movements that would strike not at the German Sixth Army fighting in Stalingrad, but rather at the Romanian Third and Fourth Armies holding the flanks northwest and south of the city. And he could see the skepticism on the faces of some senior officers who believed that attacking the weakest parts of the enemy line was cowardice rather than strategy, that Soviet forces should meet the Germans head-on in the ruins of Stalingrad rather than attempting some elaborate flanking maneuver that required precise coordination of forces separated by hundreds of kilometers. Yet Zhukov understood what these officers did not: that the German obsession with capturing Stalingrad had created a strategic vulnerability so obvious that it seemed almost too good to be true, because while the Wehrmacht had concentrated its best troops and heaviest armour in the city itself, grinding through the rubble in brutal house-to-house fighting, the flanks extending for over 400 kilometres on either side were held by Romanian, Hungarian and Italian divisions that were poorly equipped, inadequately supplied, and positioned in defensive lines so thinly stretched that a concentrated Soviet attack would break through them like tissue paper, creating the opportunity to encircle the entire German Sixth Army and turn what had been a German offensive into a catastrophic defeat that might change the entire trajectory of the war on the Eastern Front. They laughed at his plan during the initial presentation. These generals, who had spent the previous year watching the Red Army retreat across thousands of kilometers and who had developed a fatalistic acceptance that German military superiority was simply a fact that had to be endured rather than a temporary condition that could be reversed through careful planning and deception, calling Zhukov's proposal fantastical and over-ambitious, suggesting that Soviet forces lack the coordination and logistical capability to execute simultaneous attacks on two fronts separated by such distance, that Romanian forces, despite their limitations, were still professional soldiers backed by German artillery and air support, and would not simply collapse under Soviet assault, and that even if the initial breakthroughs succeeded, German forces would recognize the encirclement threat and would retreat from Stalingrad before the pincers could close, making the entire operation an expensive waste of resources that would be better employed in straightforward counterattacks against German positions where Soviet numerical superiority could be brought to bear without requiring the kind of sophisticated operational art that Soviet commanders supposedly lacked. The most vocal critic was a general whose name would later be erased from Soviet records after he was implicated in failures during the 1941 retreats, who stood up during Zhukov's presentation and declared that the plan was the kind of thing Germans do, not us, implying that Soviet forces were capable of brave frontal assaults, but not the kind of subtle maneuver warfare that Zhukov was proposing, a comment that reflected the inferiority complex that had developed among Soviet officers who had spent 18 months being outmaneuvered by Wehrmacht operations, and who had come to believe that tactical sophistication was an inherently German characteristic that Soviet forces could not replicate. We'll pause briefly before continuing. If stories like this are important to you, please consider supporting the video with a like and a subscription. After watching, a short comment, even a simple one, helps these stories reach further. Your support ensures they are not forgotten. Thank you. Let's continue. But Stalin, who had been listening silently while smoking his pipe and occasionally making notes on a pad of paper, surprised everyone by supporting Zhukov's plan, not because he fully understood the operational details or because he had suddenly developed appreciation for sophisticated strategy, but because he recognized that the political and psychological value of destroying an entire German army would be worth almost any cost, that encircling the Sixth Army at Stalingrad would demonstrate that Soviet forces could not only resist German attacks, but could also conduct offensive operations that matched German operational art, and that such a victory would boost Soviet morale while simultaneously shocking Germany and potentially encouraging Germany's allies to reconsider their commitment to the Axis. Stalin's approval came with the characteristic warning that failure would have severe consequences for the commanders responsible, phrasing that everyone in the room understood meant execution rather than mere demotion, creating enormous pressure on Zhukov to ensure that the operation succeeded, because the alternative was not just military defeat but personal destruction. Though Zhukov had calculated that the plan's chances of success were sufficiently high that the risk was acceptable given the potential strategic benefits. The deception operation designed to conceal Soviet preparations for Operation Uranus was almost as elaborate as the offensive itself, involving fake radio traffic suggesting that Soviet forces were preparing defensive positions around Stalingrad rather than massing for offensive operations. Carefully controlled leaks of false information through channels known to be monitored by German intelligence about supposed Soviet weaknesses and supply shortages, visible construction of defensive fortifications in areas away from the actual assembly points to draw German reconnaissance attention, and strict operational security that prevented even most Soviet field commanders from knowing the true objectives until days before the offensive began, measures that succeeded so well that German intelligence assessments in early November 1942 continued to portray Soviet forces as exhausted and incapable of major offensive operations. Exactly the misperception that Zhukov needed to ensure that German forces would not reinforce the Romanian flanks or withdraw from Stalingrad before the encirclement could be completed. The Romanian Third Army, holding the sector northwest of Stalingrad, consisted of approximately 150,000 troops, organised in divisions that were under-strength and poorly equipped compared to German units, with obsolete anti-tank guns that could not penetrate the armour of Soviet T-34 tanks, artillery that lacked sufficient ammunition for sustained defensive fire, and defensive positions that had been constructed hastily in open steppe terrain that offered minimal natural obstacles, weaknesses that German intelligence was aware of, but that Wehrmacht command considered acceptable risks because Romanian positions were seen as secondary sectors where Soviet attacks were unlikely and where the primary function of Allied forces was to free German troops for offensive operations in Stalingrad itself. This calculation reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of Soviet intentions and capabilities, because German planners assumed that Soviet forces would continue to focus on defending Stalingrad rather than recognizing that the city's strategic value had shifted from defensive to offensive purposes, that holding Stalingrad long enough to draw in German forces created the preconditions for a devastating counteroffensive that would exploit exactly the vulnerability that German deployment had created. The Soviet forces assembled for Operation Uranus represented the largest concentration of armour and artillery that the Red Army had managed to organise since the German invasion began, with over 1 million troops, 13,500 artillery pieces, 900 tanks, and 1,100 aircraft divided between three fronts that would conduct coordinated attacks designed to break through Romanian positions and link up approximately 100 kilometers west of Stalingrad, creating a pocket that would trap the entire German Sixth Army along with portions of the 4th Panzer Army, forces totaling approximately 300,000 German and Allied troops who would find themselves surrounded in territory where winter was beginning and where supply by air or ground would be extremely difficult. The scale of this force concentration required months of preparation involving movement of units from other sectors of the front, stockpiling of ammunition and fuel at forward depots positioned to support the offensive, training of commanders and staff officers in coordinated operations that required precise timing across multiple army groups, and most critically, maintaining absolute secrecy about the build-up to prevent German forces from discovering the threat and taking countermeasures. The offensive began on November 19, 1942, at 7:30 a.m. with a Soviet artillery barrage involving over 3,500 guns that fired for 80 minutes at Romanian positions northwest of Stalingrad. A bombardment so intense that German officers, observing from their headquarters positions, compared it to the great artillery preparations of World War I. Massive concentrations of firepower that had not been seen on the Eastern Front since the opening phases of Barbarossa. And when the barrage lifted and Soviet armour began advancing through the morning fog, Romanian defenders who had survived the shelling found themselves facing waves of T-34 tanks that their anti-tank guns could not stop and that simply overran defensive positions, continuing westward while Soviet infantry mopped up pockets of resistance, creating breakthroughs that within hours had penetrated dozens of kilometres into Romanian rear areas and that threatened to collapse the entire defensive front. The Romanian Third Army's command structure disintegrated under this assault, with division and corps headquarters losing contact with their subordinate units, communication systems being destroyed by Soviet artillery or disrupted by advancing armour, and commanders making independent decisions to retreat or surrender without coordinating with adjacent units. Exactly the kind of defensive collapse that Zhukov had predicted, but that German intelligence had insisted was impossible because they believed Romanian forces, despite their equipment limitations, would fight with sufficient determination to at least delay Soviet advances long enough for German reserves to intervene. The southern pincer of Operation Uranus launched on November 20th, one day after the northern attack, striking at the Romanian Fourth Army south of Stalingrad with similar results. Massive artillery preparation followed by armoured breakthrough that shattered Romanian defensive cohesion and sent Soviet tank columns racing westward toward the link-up point that would complete the encirclement. And within 48 hours of the offensive's start, both Soviet pincers were advancing faster than their operational plans had projected, covering in 2 days distances that had been allocated 4 days in the planning phase. Acceleration that reflected both the weakness of Romanian resistance and the effectiveness of Soviet operational execution, because the coordination between artillery, armour, and infantry that German critics had claimed Soviet forces could not achieve was being demonstrated convincingly through actual battlefield performance rather than through theoretical arguments. The German response to the Soviet offensive was initially characterized by disbelief, followed by confused attempts to organize counterattacks using whatever reserves were immediately available, because Wehrmacht commanders had convinced themselves that Soviet forces were too exhausted to conduct major operations, and that any attacks would be local counteroffensives rather than strategic encirclement attempts. And this fundamental misunderstanding of Soviet intentions meant that German forces wasted crucial hours trying to restore Romanian defensive lines rather than recognizing that the Romanian positions were irretrievably lost, and that the only way to prevent encirclement was to immediately withdraw the Sixth Army from Stalingrad while the escape corridor remained open. General Friedrich Paulus, commanding the Sixth Army, understood by November 21st that his forces were in danger of being surrounded, but was forbidden by Hitler from authorizing withdrawal, receiving direct orders that the army must hold Stalingrad regardless of the situation on the flanks, and that any attempt to retreat would be considered defeatism punishable by court-martial, orders that reflected Hitler's obsession with holding captured territory and his refusal to acknowledge that tactical withdrawal could sometimes be strategically necessary to preserve forces for future operations. The link-up of Soviet forces occurred on November 23rd at the town of Kalash, approximately 100 kilometers west of Stalingrad, when advance units from the northern and southern pincers made contact, completing the encirclement of the German Sixth Army and creating a pocket that contained approximately 300,000 Axis troops who now faced the choice of attempting to break out through Soviet lines or waiting for German forces outside the pocket to launch a relief operation, options that both carried enormous risks and uncertain chances of success. The psychological impact of the encirclement on German troops was immediate and devastating, because soldiers who had spent months advancing across Soviet territory and who had been told that final victory was imminent, suddenly found themselves cut off from supply lines and facing an enemy that had demonstrated capability to conduct complex operations that German propaganda had insisted Soviets could not perform, creating cognitive dissonance that undermined morale and raised questions about whether German military leadership actually understood the strategic situation or was simply repeating reassuring falsehoods while the military position deteriorated. The German attempt to supply the encircled Sixth Army by air represented one of the most catastrophic logistical failures of World War II, because Luftwaffe Command promised that transport aircraft could deliver 500 tons of supplies per day to the pocket, a figure that was based on theoretical calculations about aircraft capacity and sortie rates rather than on realistic assessment of weather conditions, Soviet air defences, and the actual availability of transport planes. And in practice, the Luftwaffe never came close to delivering the promised tonnage, averaging perhaps 100 tons per day during the brief periods when weather permitted flights, and when Soviet fighters did not make the approaches to Stalingrad's airfields too dangerous. Supply rates that were completely inadequate to sustain 300,000 troops in winter conditions, where fuel consumption for heating and where ammunition expenditure for defensive operations far exceeded the quantities that could be delivered by air. The relief operation launched in December 1942 by Field Marshal Erich von Manstein represented the last realistic chance to break the Soviet encirclement and extract the Sixth Army from the Stalingrad pocket, involving attacks by German armoured forces that advanced to within approximately 50 kilometres of the encircled forces before being stopped by Soviet defences that Zhukov had positioned specifically to prevent relief operations. And Manstein's subsequent recommendation that Paulus should ignore Hitler's orders and break out toward the relief force was rejected by Paulus, who feared court-martial more than he feared Soviet encirclement, a decision that sealed the fate of the Sixth Army, because once the relief operation failed, there would be no further attempts, and the encircled forces would gradually be destroyed through attrition and starvation, rather than through any dramatic final battle. The progressive collapse of the Sixth Army during January and February 1943 involved a combination of starvation as food supplies were exhausted, freezing as fuel for heating ran out, and temperatures dropped to minus 30 degrees Celsius, disease as medical supplies were depleted, and wounded soldiers died from infections that would have been treatable under normal conditions, and combat casualties as Soviet forces systematically reduced the pocket through artillery bombardment and infantry assaults that captured one defensive position after another, creating a humanitarian catastrophe where German soldiers were dying at rates approaching 1,000 per day from causes that had less to do with Soviet combat effectiveness than with the simple reality that an army of 300,000 men cannot survive in winter conditions without adequate food, fuel, and medical supplies, and that Hitler's orders to hold Stalingrad at all costs had transformed what could have been a tactical withdrawal into a humanitarian disaster that shocked even hardened Wehrmacht officers who had witnessed the brutalities of the Eastern Front campaign. The surrender of the Sixth Army on February 2, 1943, represented the largest German military defeat to that point in the war, with approximately 91,000 German and Allied soldiers entering Soviet captivity after months of suffering that had reduced them to walking skeletons barely capable of carrying their own weapons, casualties that totaled over 200,000 when combined with those killed during the encirclement battle and the subsequent siege, losses that eliminated an entire field army from German order of battle and that could not be replaced despite German mobilization of additional reserves, because the men and equipment destroyed at Stalingrad represented years of training and industrial production that could not be quickly reconstituted. The psychological impact of the Stalingrad defeat extended far beyond the immediate military consequences, because it demonstrated that German forces could be defeated not just tactically, but strategically, that Wehrmacht operational art was not inherently superior to Soviet planning, and that the mythology of German invincibility that had been carefully constructed through 2 years of victories was a lie that could no longer be sustained in the face of such obvious catastrophic failure. The strategic consequences of Operation Uranus included permanent shift of initiative on the Eastern Front from Germany to the Soviet Union, because after Stalingrad, the Wehrmacht would never again possess sufficient strength to conduct strategic offensive operations, and would spend the remainder of the war in defensive retreat interrupted by occasional local counterattacks that could not change the fundamental trajectory toward German defeat. The operation also validated Zhukov's operational approach of identifying enemy weaknesses and exploiting them through precise coordinated attacks rather than relying on brute force and numerical superiority, demonstrating that Soviet forces had evolved beyond the crude tactics of 1941 and had developed sophisticated operational capabilities that could compete with German staff work, evolution that would be demonstrated repeatedly in subsequent operations like Kursk and Bagration that employed similar principles of deception, concentration of force at decisive points, and exploitation of enemy vulnerabilities. The German failure at Stalingrad reflected multiple levels of strategic and operational incompetence, from Hitler's refusal to authorize tactical withdrawal when the encirclement became apparent, to Luftwaffe overestimation of airlift capabilities, to German intelligence failure to detect Soviet force concentrations that should have been obvious given the scale of the build-up, to Wehrmacht commanders' stubborn belief that Allied forces could hold sectors that clearly required German troops, errors that compounded each other to transform what could have been a manageable tactical setback into a catastrophic defeat that altered the course of the war. The personal account of a German soldier named Wilhelm Hoffmann, whose diary was recovered after the battle and published posthumously, provides visceral detail about the progressive deterioration of conditions inside the Stalingrad pocket during December 1942 and January 1943, describing how daily food rations were reduced from adequate to starvation levels over the course of weeks, how soldiers began slaughtering horses for meat until no horses remained, and then began eating whatever they could scavenge, including leather boots and belts boiled into soup, how the cold became unbearable as fuel supplies were exhausted and soldiers froze to death in their positions overnight, and how disease spread through units crowded into dugouts and cellars where sanitation was impossible, and where wounded soldiers died from infections because medical supplies had run out. Hoffmann's final diary entries from late January 1943 describe a unit that had ceased to function as a military organisation and had become instead a collection of starving, desperate men waiting to die or be captured, with officers unable to maintain discipline because they lacked the means to enforce orders and because survival had become an individual rather than collective concern, degeneration that illustrated how quickly military units can collapse when the basic requirements of food and warmth are no longer met. The Luftwaffe's failed airlift operation revealed the gap between theoretical calculations and operational reality, because while German Transport Command calculated that delivering 500 tons per day required approximately 250 sorties by Ju-52 transport aircraft, each carrying 2 tons of cargo, this calculation failed to account for Soviet air defences that shot down significant numbers of transports, for weather conditions that grounded flights for days at a time, for the limited number of airfields inside the pocket where aircraft could land, for the time required to unload cargo and refuel aircraft under combat conditions, and for mechanical failures that kept large percentages of the transport fleet grounded at any given time. The actual tonnage delivered averaged approximately 100 tons per day during the brief periods when operations were possible, and even this inadequate supply rate required Luftwaffe crews to fly multiple sorties per day in aircraft that were being pushed beyond their design limits, leading to high accident rates that destroyed transport planes and killed experienced crews who were irreplaceable. Losses that degraded German airlift capacity for the remainder of the war, and that demonstrated the futility of attempting to supply large ground forces by air when those forces were encircled by an enemy capable of contesting the airspace. The psychological evolution of the encircled German soldiers from confidence to despair is documented in letters that were never delivered because the last flights out of the pocket occurred in mid-January 1943. Letters that Soviet intelligence collected and analysed to understand German morale, and that reveal a progression from initial optimism that relief forces would arrive within days, to growing anxiety as weeks passed without rescue, to bitter resignation and anger at leadership that had ordered them to hold positions that clearly could not be held, and finally to nihilistic acceptance that they were going to die in this frozen wasteland thousands of kilometres from home. Emotional trajectory that mirrored the physical deterioration and that helps explain why the Sixth Army's resistance continued for weeks after any rational assessment would have concluded that surrender was the only way to save lives, because soldiers who have lost hope often continue fighting. Not because they believe in victory, but because fighting provides purpose and structure in circumstances where nothing else makes sense. The Soviet offensive operations that progressively reduced the Stalingrad pocket employed tactics that had been refined through months of urban combat, including systematic artillery bombardment to destroy defensive positions, followed by infantry assaults supported by small numbers of tanks that could navigate the rubble-strewn terrain, operations that were costly in Soviet casualties, but that were sustainable because Soviet forces outside the pocket continued to receive reinforcements and supplies, while German forces inside the pocket became progressively weaker, creating an asymmetry where Soviet commanders could accept casualties that would have been prohibitive for the Germans, because they knew that time was on their side and that eventually German resistance would collapse from starvation and exhaustion, even if Soviet attacks achieved only limited tactical gains. The final assault on the northern pocket in late January 1943 encountered German resistance that was so weak that Soviet infantry advanced without significant opposition, finding defensive positions manned by soldiers too weak from starvation to carry weapons and too sick from disease to offer meaningful resistance, casualties of Hitler's orders that required fighting to the last man despite the obvious futility of continued resistance. The decision by Field Marshal Paulus to surrender on February 2, 1943, despite Hitler's orders to fight to the death, represented a moment of moral clarity where military professionalism overcame political loyalty, because Paulus recognized that further resistance would only increase German casualties without achieving any military purpose, and that his duty to preserve the lives of his soldiers superseded his obligation to obey a political leader whose orders had become detached from military reality, though this decision came weeks later than it should have, and after tens of thousands of unnecessary deaths that could have been prevented if Paulus had chosen to disobey orders earlier in the siege, when breakout was still possible. The question of whether Paulus's surrender was courageous recognition of reality or cowardly betrayal of his oath has been debated extensively, with some historians arguing that he showed moral courage by prioritizing his soldiers' lives over his career and reputation, while others contend that a truly courageous commander would have disobeyed Hitler's standfast order in November, when breakout was still militarily feasible, rather than waiting until surrender was the only option remaining. The treatment of German prisoners taken at Stalingrad reflected the brutal conditions that characterized the Eastern Front, with approximately 91,000 soldiers entering Soviet captivity in conditions so poor that fewer than 6,000 would survive to return to Germany after the war. Mortality rates that resulted from a combination of the prisoners' already weakened condition after months of starvation and disease, the inadequate Soviet POW camp infrastructure that could not provide sufficient food or medical care for such large numbers, the Soviet desire for revenge against an enemy that had committed numerous atrocities during the invasion, and the general brutality of Stalinist administration that viewed human life as expendable in service of state objectives. The German soldiers who survived Soviet captivity would not return home until the mid-1950s, spending over a decade in labor camps where they were worked to near death while being subjected to political indoctrination designed to turn them into communist sympathizers, experiences that traumatized the survivors and that created another dimension of the Stalingrad catastrophe that extended long after the battle itself had ended. The strategic impact of Stalingrad on Germany's alliance system was immediate and severe, with Italy, Romania, and Hungary all beginning to explore possibilities for separate peace with the Allies after witnessing what had happened to their forces at Stalingrad, because the battle had demonstrated that Germany could not protect its allies from Soviet counteroffensives, and that association with Germany might lead to catastrophic military defeat rather than the easy victories that Axis propaganda had promised. The Romanian losses at Stalingrad were particularly severe, with entire divisions being destroyed and tens of thousands of soldiers killed or captured, casualties that eliminated much of Romania's trained military manpower and that contributed to Romania's eventual defection from the Axis in August 1944, when Soviet forces reached Romanian territory and King Michael ordered his forces to switch sides, a decision that would have been unthinkable in 1942, but that became inevitable after Stalingrad demonstrated the trajectory of the war. The propaganda value of the Stalingrad victory for the Soviet Union cannot be overstated, because it provided the first clear evidence that the Red Army could not only resist German attacks, but could destroy entire German armies through sophisticated operational planning and execution, proof that contradicted German propaganda claims about Slavic inferiority and Soviet military incompetence, and that validated Stalin's decision to continue fighting despite the catastrophic losses of 1941 and early 1942. The celebration of the Stalingrad victory became central to Soviet national identity and mythology, portrayed as the turning point when the Great Patriotic War shifted from defensive desperation to offensive triumph, narrative that served important political purposes by legitimizing Soviet sacrifices and by demonstrating that socialist organization could compete with capitalist economies in total war, though this mythologization also simplified and distorted the historical reality in ways that exaggerated Soviet capabilities while minimizing the role of factors like German strategic errors and Hitler's refusal to authorize withdrawal. The military lessons that Western observers drew from Stalingrad influenced Allied strategic planning for the remainder of the war, particularly regarding the importance of maintaining flexible defensive positions rather than holding ground at all costs, because the battle demonstrated that even elite forces could be destroyed if they were fixed in place and encircled, and that military commanders needed authority to make tactical withdrawals when necessary to preserve forces for future operations rather than being constrained by political directives that prioritized symbolic holdings over military effectiveness. The American and British armies' emphasis on mobility and on avoiding encirclement reflected careful study of what had happened to the German Sixth Army and determination not to repeat the errors that had led to that catastrophe, though whether these lessons were correctly applied in subsequent operations like Market Garden would remain debatable. The technological implications of Stalingrad were less obvious than the strategic and operational lessons, but equally significant, because the battle demonstrated that modern armies required enormous logistics infrastructure to sustain operations, and that cutting supply lines could be as effective as destroying combat forces, realizations that would shape post-war military thinking about the importance of logistics and about the vulnerability of forces that extended beyond their supply capabilities. The failure of the Luftwaffe airlift also demonstrated that air power could not substitute for ground lines of communication when supplying large forces in sustained operations, lesson that would be validated repeatedly in subsequent conflicts where attempts to supply encircled forces by air failed because the tonnages required exceeded what aircraft could deliver under combat conditions. The comparison between the encirclement of the Sixth Army at Stalingrad and previous German encirclement victories like Kiev in 1941, where over 600,000 Soviet soldiers were captured, revealed how much Soviet operational capabilities had evolved in 18 months, because while German forces in 1941 had been able to execute sophisticated pincer movements that Soviet commanders could not counter, by late 1942, Soviet forces had learned to employ the same tactics effectively, and German commanders had become complacent and had failed to recognize that the operational superiority they had enjoyed was temporary rather than permanent, complacency that contributed directly to the Stalingrad catastrophe, because it led to underestimation of Soviet capabilities and overestimation of German advantages. The role of Romanian forces in the Stalingrad disaster became a source of post-war controversy, with German accounts often blaming Romanian weakness for the encirclement, while Romanian historians countered that German command had positioned Romanian troops in untenable defensive positions without providing adequate support, and had then scapegoated them when the obvious consequences materialized. Debate that reflected broader tensions between Germany and its allies about responsibility for Axis defeats and about whether smaller nations had been victimized by German strategic incompetence or had been willing participants in aggressive war who deserved to share blame for its failure. The historical evidence suggests that while Romanian forces did collapse quickly under Soviet assault, this was entirely predictable given their equipment deficiencies and the strength of the Soviet attack, and that German commanders who relied on Romanian forces to hold critical sectors while concentrating German strength in Stalingrad made a calculated risk that proved disastrously wrong. The winter conditions during the Stalingrad siege created suffering that extended beyond normal combat hardships, with temperatures regularly dropping below -20 degrees Celsius, and with blizzards that reduced visibility to meters and made movement nearly impossible. Conditions that Soviet forces were marginally better adapted to through previous winter warfare experience and through superior winter equipment, including felt boots and quilted jackets that provided better insulation than German winter clothing. Advantages that became decisive as the siege prolonged and as German supply difficulties meant that warm clothing and fuel for heating became unavailable, while Soviet forces outside the pocket continued to receive adequate winter equipment. Environmental factors that killed German soldiers as effectively as Soviet weapons, and that illustrated how climate could become a weapon when one side was better prepared to cope with extreme conditions. The question of whether the Sixth Army could have broken out of the encirclement if Paulus had disobeyed Hitler's orders in late November 1942 has been extensively analysed through comparison with similar situations where German forces successfully broke out of Soviet encirclements, and the consensus among military historians is that breakout was probably possible in the first few days after the encirclement closed, but became progressively more difficult as Soviet forces strengthened their encirclement ring and as German forces inside the pocket became weaker from reduced rations and fuel shortages, suggesting that Paulus's decision to obey Hitler's stand-fast order during the critical period when breakout was feasible represents one of the most consequential command decisions of World War II, a choice that prioritized political loyalty over military judgment and that condemned hundreds of thousands of soldiers to death or captivity when an alternative path existed that would have preserved most of the army for future operations. The psychological impact of Stalingrad on German civilian morale was carefully managed by Goebbels' propaganda ministry through a combination of initially concealing the scope of the disaster and then pivoting to portraying it as heroic sacrifice rather than catastrophic defeat. Rhetoric that emphasized the supposed courage of German soldiers who had fought to the last man rather than acknowledging that they had been ordered to die in a futile defense that served no military purpose. Narrative construction that was partially successful in maintaining support for continued war effort, but that also created cynicism among Germans who could see the contradiction between official claims of heroic victory and the reality of hundreds of thousands of casualties and the obvious fact that the war was going badly despite reassuring propaganda. The Allied perspective on Stalingrad, particularly from American and British observers, reflected relief that Soviet forces were proving capable of not just resisting, but actively defeating German armies, because the survival of the Soviet Union as an effective fighting force was essential to Allied strategy, given that Soviet forces were engaging the majority of German combat strength and preventing Germany from concentrating forces against British and American positions in North Africa and the Mediterranean. The Stalingrad victory also influenced Allied strategic debates about opening a second front in Western Europe, because Soviet success demonstrated that German forces were not invincible and that well-planned offensive operations could achieve decisive results. Arguments that would eventually lead to the D-Day invasion, though timing remained controversial, with Stalin pressing for earlier action, while Churchill and Roosevelt argued for waiting until proper preparations could be completed. The industrial and economic implications of losing the Sixth Army extended beyond the immediate manpower casualties to include the destruction of enormous quantities of equipment, including over 900 artillery pieces, 1,500 tanks and assault guns, thousands of trucks and vehicles, and millions of rounds of ammunition that had been stockpiled for the Stalingrad offensive, losses that represented months of German industrial production and that could not be quickly replaced, despite Germany's attempts to mobilize additional resources through programs like Total War Mobilization that Albert Speer would implement in 1943. The Soviet capture of this equipment also provided valuable intelligence about German manufacturing capabilities and technological developments, because examining captured tanks and weapons allowed Soviet engineers to understand German design approaches and to identify weaknesses that could be exploited in future engagements. The question of whether Stalingrad was a turning point or simply one battle in a longer war of attrition has been debated by historians who note that while Stalingrad was psychologically and symbolically important, the actual military balance on the Eastern Front had been shifting toward the Soviet Union for months before the encirclement occurred, with Soviet industrial mobilization beginning to outproduce German factories and with Soviet forces learning tactical and operational lessons that reduced German advantages in training and doctrine, suggesting that Stalingrad was more a symptom of changing military dynamics than the cause of those changes. This more nuanced interpretation acknowledges Stalingrad's importance while recognizing that the outcome of the Eastern Front was determined by multiple factors, including industrial capacity, manpower reserves, strategic decision-making, and technological innovation, rather than by any single battle, regardless of how dramatic or decisive it appeared. The urban warfare tactics that both German and Soviet forces developed during the Stalingrad fighting influenced post-war military doctrine about how to conduct operations in built-up areas, with lessons including the importance of combined arms operations, integrating infantry, armor, and artillery, the value of small unit initiative when centralized command and control breaks down, the need for specialized training and equipment for urban combat, and the recognition that urban warfare is inherently costly and should be avoided when possible because it favors defenders and neutralizes many advantages that attackers might have in open terrain. The specific tactics of house-to-house fighting that Soviet forces perfected in Stalingrad, including storm groups that would clear buildings systematically while supporting elements provided covering fire, became standard approaches that would be employed in subsequent urban battles throughout the war and in post-war conflicts. The impact of Stalingrad on German military culture involved a loss of confidence in strategic leadership that would contribute to the July 1944 assassination attempt against Hitler, because field commanders and staff officers who had witnessed the catastrophe understood that Hitler's refusal to authorize tactical withdrawals and his insistence on holding ground regardless of military logic would lead to future disasters, and that preserving the German state might require removing him from power even if that meant violating military oaths and traditions. The failed assassination and the subsequent purge of officers suspected of disloyalty weakened German military effectiveness during the final year of the war by removing experienced commanders and by creating atmosphere of suspicion and fear that inhibited honest military advice and that made strategic planning difficult when political considerations overrode military necessity. The Soviet use of Stalingrad in post-war propaganda and national mythology created a narrative of heroic resistance and ultimate triumph that served important political purposes in legitimizing Soviet sacrifices and in demonstrating the superiority of socialist organization over fascist aggression, narrative that was elaborated through films, literature, monuments, and ceremonies that commemorated the battle and that portrayed it as the moment when the tide of war turned irreversibly against Germany. The city itself was renamed Volgograd in 1961 during de-Stalinization efforts to remove Stalin's name from public spaces, though the association between the city and the battle remained so strong that many Russians still refer to the Battle of Stalingrad rather than using the modern city name when discussing the historical event, demonstrating how battles can become so iconic that they transcend the specific geographic and political contexts in which they occurred. The comparison between Operation Uranus and subsequent Soviet offensive operations like Bagration in 1944 reveals how Soviet operational art continued to evolve throughout the war, with later operations employing even more sophisticated deception, greater coordination across multiple fronts, and more effective exploitation of breakthroughs, progression that demonstrated that the success at Stalingrad was not a one-time achievement, but rather represented the beginning of a learning process that would make Soviet forces increasingly effective at conducting large-scale offensive operations that could consistently defeat German defensive positions. The fact that Soviet forces went from the catastrophic defeats of 1941 to the sophisticated operational successes of 1944 to 1945 in less than 4 years represents one of the most remarkable military transformations in history and suggests that the Red Army's institutional capacity for learning from experience was more effective than German or Western observers had anticipated. The memorialization of Stalingrad through monuments, museums, and commemorative events has created a rich symbolic landscape that serves both historical and political purposes, with the most famous monument being the Motherland statue, erected in 1967, that stands 85 meters tall and dominates the Volgograd skyline, symbolizing both the sacrifice of those who died in the battle and the Soviet Union's ultimate triumph over fascism. The annual Victory Day celebrations on May 9th often feature special commemorations of Stalingrad veterans, though as these veterans have aged and died, the commemorations have shifted from participant memories to historical reconstruction and education, transition that raises questions about how battles should be remembered when living memory fades and when political contexts change in ways that make wartime alliances and enmities seem distant and perhaps less relevant to contemporary concerns.